Is this some kind of joke? The voice, sharp and laced with the condescending arrogance of a man barely out of his 20s, cut through the tense silence on the airfield. Lieutenant Miller, his jaw tight and his pristine uniform a stark contrast to the grease-stained chaos around him, glared at the old man. "Sir," I said, "do you know where you are? This is a restricted military exercise." James Albert, 82 years old, didn't flinch. He stood with a stillness that seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the soldiers and technicians scurrying around the silent helicopter. His hands, gnarled and weathered like ancient oak, rested at his sides. His gaze wasn't on the fuming lieutenant but on the Black Hawk. It sat crippled on the tarmac, its rotors drooping like the leaves of a dying plant, a monument to a multi-million-dollar failure. The drill had been a showcase, a demonstration of cutting-edge readiness for a visiting three-star general. Now it was a circus of incompetence. The Black Hawk's engine had coughed, sputtered, and died mid-sequence, forcing an emergency landing that was anything but graceful. The air still hummed with the ghost of its turbine whine, a phantom limb of sound. "I need an answer, old man," Miller snapped, stepping closer, his polished boots crunching on the gravel. "This is not a retirement home tour. How did you get past the perimeter?" He was playing to an audience, the anxious tech crew, the assembled soldiers, and a gallery of observers in the distant bleachers, all watching the humiliation unfold. He needed a target for the pressure building in his chest, and the quiet old man in the faded visitor's pass was perfect. James's eyes, a pale, clear blue, finally shifted from the helicopter to the lieutenant. They were calm, patient, and held a depth that made Miller vaguely uncomfortable. "I believe the primary turbine's fuel regulator is vapor-locked," James said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. The whine just before it cut out. The pitch was too high. It was starving. A nervous titter went through the tech crew. Miller's face flushed with crimson. He had just spent 20 minutes listening to his lead technician, a kid with a master's degree in aeronautical engineering, blame a dozen different phantom electronic gremlins through a diagnostic laptop. This old man, who looked like he'd just wandered off a fishing pier, was talking about it like it was a stubborn lawnmower. "Vapor-locked?" Miller scoffed, his voice dripping with derision. "This is a T700 GE 701D engine with a fully digitized control unit, not a Model T Ford. What would you know about it?" He gestured dismissively at James. "Thank you for your input. Now please return to the observation area before I have you escorted." James didn't move. His gaze drifted back to the lifeless machine. He could feel it. It was more than just seeing. It was a sixth sense honed over a lifetime of listening to the language of machines. Every engine had a voice, a personality. This one was in pain, and it was telling them exactly where it hurt, but nobody was listening. They were too busy looking at screens, trusting algorithms over intuition. "The digital controls can't tell you everything, son," James said, his tone even, not rising to the bait. "Sometimes you have to put your hands on it, feel the lines, listen to what it's not doing." Miller took this as a direct challenge to his authority. The general was watching. The whole base was watching. His career was stalling on this very tarmac. He rounded on the lead technician. "Sergeant, have you found anything? Anything at all?" The young sergeant, sweat beading on his brow, shook his head, avoiding Miller's gaze. "No, sir. All diagnostics are green. The computer insists the engine is fine. It just won't start. It's not getting fuel, but the system says the pumps are working." "It's not the pump," James said, almost to himself, but his voice carried in the strained silence. "It's the regulator. The thermal expansion from the drill sequence was just a little too much for it. It's an old design flaw they never quite engineered out." This was the last straw for Miller. He stepped right into James's personal space, his face a mask of fury. "An old design flaw. And you, I suppose, were on the design team." He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Look at your hands. You look like you've been changing tractor oil for 50 years. You are to leave this area now. That is a direct order. If you refuse, I will have you detained for interfering with a military operation." The threat hung in the air, thick and suffocating. A small crowd of onlookers had started to gather at a respectful distance, their phones held low, recording the confrontation. The injustice was palpable. The young, arrogant officer berating a calm, quiet elder. James looked down at his own hands, the object of Miller's scorn. The knuckles were swollen with arthritis, the skin a roadmap of scars and healed-over burns. The fingernails, despite a thorough scrubbing that morning, were permanently underlined with the ghost of black grease. To Lieutenant Miller, they were the hands of an irrelevant old man, a nobody. But for a fleeting, searing moment, the scene on the tarmac dissolved. The bright sun and the silent Black Hawk were replaced by the humid darkness of a jungle canopy, thick with the smell of rotten cordite. The hands were younger, stronger, but just as steady. They were plunged deep into the guts of a Huey, its fuselage riddled with bullet holes. Smoke, thick and acrid, billowed from the engine cowling. In the distance, the rhythmic chatter of an M60 provided a deadly backbeat. A young soldier, his face pale with fear, was yelling, "We gotta go, Chief. They're coming." But the hands didn't stop. They worked with a surgeon's precision in the greasy darkness, tightening a clamp, rerouting a severed fuel line, coaxing life back into the dying bird. Those hands knew pressure, they knew failure, and they knew how to make things fly when the alternative was death. The image vanished as quickly as it came. James was back on the tarmac, the sun glinting off Miller's sunglasses. His hands, the very same hands, hung calmly at his sides. The confrontation had reached its peak. Miller, emboldened by James's silence, gestured to two security airmen who were watching from the edge of the scene. "Escort this man to the security office. He's a potential risk. We'll have him evaluated." The word evaluated was a clear implication of senility, a final public humiliation. The airmen started forward, their expressions uncomfortable. They didn't want to do this. The crowd murmured, a wave of disapproval rippling through the onlookers. They were witnessing a line being crossed, a fundamental rule of respect being shattered. But not everyone was just watching. Standing near the back of the anxious tech crew was Master Sergeant Evans, a man in his late 50s with a face like a worn leather boot. He'd seen 100 hotshot lieutenants like Miller come and go, but he'd also seen men like James Albert. He'd served long enough to recognize the quiet, unshakable confidence of someone who had forgotten more about their craft than a young officer would ever learn. There was a familiar economy to the old man's movements, a stillness under fire that you didn't learn in a classroom. It was forged. While Miller was delivering his final arrogant threat, Evans had already made a decision. He turned his back to the scene, pulling his phone from his pocket with a practiced, discreet motion. He found a number in his contacts, a buddy of his who worked as a civilian archivist over at the base historical command. The call connected on the second ring. "Pete, it's Frank Evans," he said, his voice low and urgent, shielded by the fuselage of a nearby support truck. "I need a favor, and I need it yesterday." "What's up, Frank?" "Everything okay over at the drill?" Pete's voice was casual. "Negative. It's a goat rope. Listen, I need you to run a name for me. A civilian observer. Name's James Albert. Albert. "James Albert," Pete repeated. "What about him? Did he win the raffle?" "Just run the name, Pete. Now," Evans insisted. "He's in the middle of a situation with Lieutenant Miller over the dead Black Hawk. Miller's about to have him hauled off by security." There was a pause, then the sound of typing. Evans watched as the two airmen reluctantly reached James, placing their hands gently on his elbows. The old man didn't resist. He simply stood there, his dignity intact, a silent rebuke to the chaos around him. The general was now on his feet in the observation tower, his binoculars fixed on the scene, his expression unreadable but clearly displeased. "Frank," Pete's voice came back over the phone, and it was completely different. The casual tone was gone, replaced by one of pure shock. "Frank, where did you say this man is?" "Right here, on the flight line." "Why?" "Oh man," Pete breathed. "You are not going to believe this. Hang on." There was a muffled shout in the background, the sound of a chair scraping back violently. Evans could hear Pete yelling to someone else in his office. "Get Colonel Westhoff on the line. Now. Tell him it's a Code Alpha situation at the air show." A shiver of apprehension went down Evans's spine. Code Alpha wasn't a real code. It was slang for a situation so monumentally screwed up that generals started firing people. "Pete, talk to me. Who is he?" Pete came back on the line, breathless. "Frank, that's not just James Albert. According to his file, his full name is Chief Warrant Officer 5 James Ghost Wrench Albert, retired. He was one of the lead engineers for the original T-700 project back in the 70s. He didn't just work on the engine. His field notes became the foundation for the goddamn maintenance manual, the one every tech on that field is supposed to have memorized. He's a living legend." The scene in the archivist's office was one of controlled panic. Pete, a balding man in his 60s, was standing now, the phone pressed hard against his ear. His assistant was frantically dialing, her eyes wide. "Sir, I have Colonel Westhoff's aide," she said, her voice trembling slightly. Pete snatched the other phone. "This is Pete Gallo at the Historical Archives. I need to speak to the colonel immediately." "No, I don't care if he's in a meeting. Tell him James Albert is at the training field and Lieutenant Miller is trying to have him arrested." The aide's professional calm shattered. A flurry of muffled, urgent words followed, and then the base commander's voice, sharp and commanding, barked through the phone. "Gallo, what did you just say?" Pete repeated the information, his own voice steady despite the adrenaline. He could hear the colonel curse, a string of words that would have made a drill sergeant blush. "Keep him on the line, Gallo, and get me the general's frequency. Now." The line went dead. Pete looked at his assistant. The entire world is about to descend on that airfield. Back on the tarmac, Lieutenant Miller was basking in the restored sense of order. The two airmen were politely but firmly guiding James away from the helicopter. The perceived problem was being removed. Miller straightened his uniform, preparing the speech he would give the general, blaming the failure on a freak mechanical issue and the unfortunate distraction caused by an unauthorized civilian. He was already rewriting history in his mind. "See," he said smugly to his lead technician, "that's how you handle a breach in protocol. Now let's get this piece of junk towed back to the hangar." He turned his back on James, a final act of dismissal. It was his last moment of ignorant bliss. He never saw it coming. He only heard it. A high-pitched siren. Not the familiar ambulance or fire truck, but the piercing yelp of a command escort. Heads snapped toward the main access road. A convoy of black Chevrolet Suburbans, flags fluttering from their fenders, was speeding toward them, followed by a sand-colored Humvee with the general's 3-star plate on the front. They weren't driving, they were flying. A wave of official fury hurtling across the concrete. The convoy screeched to a halt just yards from the crippled Black Hawk, doors flying open before the vehicles had fully stopped. The first man out was Colonel Westhoff, the base commander, his face a thundercloud. The second was the visiting 3-star general himself, his expression one of cold, controlled rage. They didn't even glance at the helicopter. They ignored Lieutenant Miller, who had frozen in place, his smug expression melting into one of dawning horror. They marched, their steps synchronized and powerful, directly toward the two airmen escorting the old man. "Halt!" The colonel's voice was a physical blow. The airmen froze, dropping their hands from James's arms as if they'd been electrocuted. The general, a man who commanded an entire army corps, a man whose presence usually demanded salutes and rigid attention, came to a stop directly in front of James Albert. The entire airfield, from the tech crew to the onlookers to the VIPs in the tower, went utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the wind whistling over the Black Hawk's silent rotors. The general looked at James, at the faded visitor's pass, at the weathered face and the calm, knowing eyes. He looked at the grease-stained hands that Lieutenant Miller had mocked. Then, in a move that sent a shockwave across the field, he brought his hand up in the sharpest, most respectful salute of his long career. His posture was ramrod straight. His gaze locked on James with an intensity that bordered on reverence. Mr. Albert," the general's voice boomed, carrying across the tarmac, every syllable imbued with authority and respect. "It is a profound honor, sir." A collective gasp went through the crowd. Lieutenant Miller looked like he had been punched in the gut. His mind struggled to process what he was seeing. The general held the salute for a long moment before dropping his hand. He then turned to the stunned and silent audience. "For those of you who are unaware," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a lecturer at the War College, "you are in the presence of a giant. This is Chief Warrant Officer 5 James Albert, retired. The man you know as a civilian observer is better known in certain circles as the Ghost Wrench." He paused, letting the name sink in. When the Army was first developing the Black Hawk platform, the T-700 engine was temperamental. It kept failing in ways the engineers in their clean labs couldn't predict. So they sent a team of their best field mechanics to the proving grounds. A young CW2 Albert was on that team. He didn't just learn the engine, he communed with it. He wrote the book on its quirks, its whispers, its tells, the diagnostic protocols you all follow on your laptops, the troubleshooting trees. Most of them started as handwritten notes in one of his logbooks. The general took a step closer to Miller, his shadow falling over the young officer. There's a story about him from a field test in Panama. A prototype engine seized up mid-flight over the jungle. The engineers on the ground said it was a total loss, a catastrophic failure. They were ready to write off a multi-million-dollar asset. James Albert rappelled from a second helicopter, diagnosed a collapsed bearing by sound alone while dangling from a rope, and guided the pilot through a controlled glide landing that saved the crew and the aircraft. He then spent 36 hours in the jungle, stripping the engine with a standard toolkit and rebuilding it on the spot. He turned back to the crowd. "That is who you have been watching. That is whose advice was dismissed." The vindication was absolute, a powerful current of truth that washed over the entire scene. Master Sergeant Evans allowed himself a small, grim smile. The two airmen who had been escorting James now stood at a rigid parade rest, their eyes fixed forward, trying to disappear. The general's gaze, now as cold and hard as granite, fell upon Lieutenant Miller. The young officer was pale, trembling slightly. The entire architecture of his world had collapsed in the space of 90 seconds. "Lieutenant," the general said, his voice dropping to a dangerously quiet level. "Your primary duty as an officer is to leverage every asset at your disposal to accomplish the mission. Today you had the single greatest asset on this entire base standing right in front of you, and you treated him with arrogance, disrespect, and profound ignorance." He gestured to Colonel Westhoff. "Colonel, this officer has demonstrated a failure in judgment so complete that it calls his fitness for command into question. He is relieved of his duties, effective immediately. A formal review will determine his future or lack thereof in my army." Colonel Westhoff nodded grimly. "Yes, General." Miller opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. He just stood there, a hollowed-out shell of the man he was minutes before. The general turned back to James, his entire demeanor softening once more. He gestured toward the silent, hulking Black Hawk. "Mr. Albert, James, I suspect she'll listen to you. The bird is yours, if you'll have her." James Albert simply nodded. He looked past the general, past the shamed lieutenant, and his eyes settled on the anxious faces of the young tech crew. He gave them a small, almost imperceptible nod of encouragement. Then he said, his voice calm and steady, "A lesson in itself. A machine is just a machine. It's got no ego. It tells you the truth if you're willing to listen." He walked toward the helicopter, his steps unhurried. The crowd parted for him like the sea before Moses. As he reached the engine cowling, he placed his right hand flat against the cool, dark metal, and in that moment of contact, another image flashed. Not a jungle, but a sterile, brightly lit workshop 30 years ago. A younger James, now a seasoned instructor in his 40s, stood before the first generation of Black Hawk technicians. He held up a small, intricate piece of metal. It was a fuel regulator. "Look here," he was saying, pointing with a screwdriver to a tiny valve. "The simulations say this will never stick, but in high humidity, after a rapid temperature spike, a microscopic film can form right here. The computer will never see it. The sensors will read normal, but the engine will starve. You have to learn to feel for it, to listen for the silence where there should be a hiss." He was teaching a lesson born of experience, a tactile truth that had been lost to a generation that trusted screens more than their own senses. He pulled his hand away from the cowling, the echo of the past informing his present. He turned to the lead technician, the young sergeant who was now looking at him with a mixture of awe and shame. "Get me a 13mm wrench and a flathead screwdriver," James said quietly, "and tell your men to watch closely." The team scrambled to obey, their earlier frantic energy replaced by a focused, reverent attention. James didn't lecture or grandstand. He worked with a quiet, efficient grace that was mesmerizing to watch. He tapped on a fuel line, listening to the resonance. He ran his scarred fingertips over a junction, feeling for a subtle vibration that wasn't there. He had the sergeant try the ignition sequence one more time, but this time James's ear was pressed against the engine housing, his eyes closed in concentration. "There," he murmured. "That's it." He directed the young technician, showing him exactly where to insert the screwdriver, not to pry but to tap. "Gently," he coached. 3 sharp taps, right there. The technician did as he was told. A faint click, almost inaudible under the wind, echoed from within the machinery. "Now," James said, "try it again." The pilot in the cockpit, who had been watching the entire drama unfold over his comms, flipped the switch. The starter motor whined, and then, with a deep-throated cough, the T-700 engine sputtered. It caught, faltered for a second, and then roared to life, a triumphant, deafening blast of power that blew dust and hats across the tarmac. The rotors began to spin, slowly at first, then gaining speed, a rising thrum of sound that was the very definition of victory. The entire airfield erupted in a spontaneous wave of applause and cheers. The technicians, their faces split with grins of relief and amazement, clapped each other on the back. The general simply stood there, a broad, satisfied smile on his face. In the weeks that followed, the story of James "Ghost Wrench" Albert became legend on the base. Colonel Westhoff mandated a new training module for all aviation maintenance personnel. It was officially called the Advanced Tactile Diagnostics Course, but everyone on base knew it by its real name, the Albert Protocol. It emphasized hands-on intuition and listening skills, forcing technicians to step away from their laptops and reconnect with the machines they tended. Lieutenant Miller was not in the end discharged. The general, after a long conversation with James, decided that a lesson learned the hard way was more valuable than a career destroyed. Miller was demoted to second lieutenant and reassigned to a logistics depot in the most remote corner of the state, a humbling, career-altering penance. About a month later, James Albert was sitting in the base commissary, enjoying a quiet cup of coffee. A young man in a logistics uniform approached his table, his expression hesitant and deeply humbled. It was Miller. "Sir," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "Mr. Albert." James looked up and gestured to the empty chair across from him. "Lieutenant." Miller sat down, his eyes not quite meeting James's. I wanted to apologize. Properly. There's no excuse for my behavior. You were right and I was an arrogant fool. I'm sorry." James took a slow sip of his coffee. He looked at the young man, seeing not the arrogant officer from the airfield, but a kid who had learned a brutal, necessary lesson. "Everyone makes mistakes, son," James said, his voice gentle. "The important thing isn't that you fell down, it's that you're willing to get back up. The best mechanics and the best leaders spend more time listening than they do talking." He slid a fresh donut from his plate across the table toward Miller. "Now sit down. Tell me what they've got you doing over in logistics." It was an act of quiet grace, an offer of mentorship where a lesser man would have held a grudge. It was the final, most important lesson of the day. If you were inspired by the story of James Albert's quiet valor, please like this video and share it with someone who respects the wisdom of our veterans. Don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Valor and hit the notification bell for more stories of unassuming heroes among us.